Ask me what I'm afraid of when I'm sailing offshore in the open ocean, and I'll tell you, it isn't sharks. I've swam with sharks. It isn't rocks. They usually stay in the same spot. It isn't even pirates. It's hurricanes. That is 100% the honest truth, and they scare me more than anything else on the ocean. They're unpredictable. You cannot outrun them. They don't give a shit how strong your boat is. The best seamanship in the world can't overcome a storm that powerful. Given the wrong patch of ocean and the wrong day of the year, they are simply the one force out here that a strong hull and good seamanship can't always beat. This is the story of the strongest type of boat human beings know how to build, coupled with a young, very talented captain in a corner of the ocean where none of that was good enough. In October of 1998, a 282-foot schooner called the Fantome sailed into the Western Caribbean with 31 people aboard and a hurricane building over the horizon. She was riveted steel, built the way they built ships and bridges before welding was invented. Back when building a thing that was meant to last was held together by hand, one hammered rivet at a time. She was 71 years old and had already outlived 2 world wars and a line of famous owners. Her captain was 32 years old, gifted, careful, adored by his crew, and he did almost everything right. And by the following night, all 31 of them were gone. No wreck, no bodies, no distress call that anyone on Earth could answer. The sea took them so completely that to this day, this mystery has never been solved. I've spent years out on the ocean, and these are the stories that stay with me. The wrecks, the rescues, and the choices that decide who's coming home. You don't have to be a sailor to feel them, but if you are, they may change the way you look at the sea. And by the end of this one, you're going to understand 3 things that most tellings get wrong. The forecast lied to a good captain, the hurricane hole that he could not squeeze his ship into, and the one piece of technology that could have saved all 31 of them was only 5 days away from being switched on for the first time. If this is your kind of story, subscribe and sail with us. But to understand what happened out there, you need to understand the Fantome. 1927. In a shipyard on the Italian coast, a yard whose business it was to build warships, they finished something that had no business being there. A 282-foot sailing yacht, one of the most beautiful in the world at the time. Her steel hull, as the story goes, had begun years earlier for the Navy and had been left half-built when the First World War ended. Her keel was meant for guns, bought and reborn as a rich man's dream. The man who bought her was an English duke, and he called her Flying Cloud. After that, she passed through the kinds of hands that sound like I'm making them up. An heir to the Guinness fortune, who renamed her Fantome, Aristotle Onassis, the shipping magnate who would go on to marry Jackie Kennedy, JFK's widow, and finally, in 1969, a Miami outfit called Windjammer, who made her the flagship of a fleet that sold a very particular dream. No shoes, no schedule, rum on deck, and the trade winds. This was the old way of going to sea. Now, look at this beautiful ship. She was what's called a four-masted staysail schooner. And I know this is a mouthful, especially if you're not a sailor. Probably sounds like gibberish. But give me 30 seconds, because if you understand this, you'll be much more apt to make your own conclusion at the end of the story. 4 masts. Count them. 1, 2, 3, 4. And the word schooner just means that her sails run the length of the boat, front to back, not slung sideways like a pirate ship. Fore and aft is the sailor's term for it. And staysail tells you what fills in the spaces between those masts. Not big, boxy, four-sided sails like this, but tall triangles, set like the forward jibs. one behind the other on wires that run from mast to mast. Put it together and you get this: 4 tall masts and a wall of overlapping sail climbing up between them. It's a beautiful rig, quick through the water, and a massive amount of windage. It's a giant surface for wind to grab. In a fair breeze, that's a gift. It's the whole point, and it's what makes her fly. In a hurricane, this rig turns on her. Strip every sail down, and she's still got a ton of surface area for the wind to push on. And one more thing to hold on to. She was steel. And not just any mild steel. Oh no. She was riveted steel. Her hull was thousands of steel plates, overlapped, caulked, and fastened by hand with red-hot rivets. It's the same way they built the Golden Gate Bridge, the Eiffel Tower, and any other steel works we put up to stand for 100 years. And it's a way of building that we've almost entirely walked away from. Welding took over in the shipyards by the Second World War, and bolts finished off the rivet on bridges a couple of decades later. And today, that craft only survives when people restore these riveted monuments. It makes for a tremendously strong, tremendously long-lived hull. But she was also a 71-year-old passenger conversion. Big deck houses and open companionways, just like a cruise ship. She had none of the watertight subdivision that a modern ship her size would have. She was a very sound, very well-built old gal. She just had a lot of ways for the water to get in. Her captain was Guyan March, 32 years old, British, Windjammer's golden boy. At sea since his early 20s, he was the kind of skipper that crews asked to sail with. And his crew, 31 souls in all, came from all over the map. But the heart of them came from one place, New Amsterdam, Guyana. 11 of the 31 from one single town. They sailed out of Omoa on the coast of Honduras, a 6-day charter through the Bay Islands and up the Belize Reef. And I'll tell you, I've sailed that entire coast, and it is some of the most beautiful, healthy reef that I've ever seen in the world. But here's the problem. It's late October in the Western Caribbean, and that raises one uncomfortable question. What the hell is a deep-drafted 300-foot schooner doing in this section of ocean in the most dangerous part of the hurricane season? And with tourists at that. The answer is that Windjammer ran these boats year-round, straight through the season, because that's the business. And that decision, the normal, profitable, year-round decision made in an office in Miami Beach, is the quiet crime at the center of this entire story. Because the repercussions didn't land on the people in that office. They didn't land, thank God, on the paying passengers either. Those repercussions landed directly on the 31 crew. Let me teach you the one thing that makes this corner of the map so dangerous for a boat that size. Because apparently nobody understood this, and when I explain it to you, it's going to look so obvious. Most people picture a hurricane as something you can see coming for a week. A spinning smudge marching across the Atlantic while forecasters track it. And yes, that's pretty much how it goes in the early season. But late in the year, the action moves west, into the Caribbean, and into the western corner, right where the Fantome was. This section of the Caribbean holds the warmest water and the calmest upper winds in the entire basin at exactly this time of year. Which means late season storms out here don't announce themselves from across the ocean. They spin up almost on top of you. If you take anything from this video, this should be it. October in the Western Caribbean is not the edge of the season. It's the beginning of the most dangerous part of the season. And in the last week of that October, it did exactly what it was built to do. It grew a monster. 2 days later, it had a name. The 13th storm of the season, and the 13th name waiting on the list was Mitch. Make of that what you will. It didn't build like an ordinary storm, it exploded. In a single day, its pressure fell off a cliff and it climbed all the way to a Category 5 with winds around 180 miles an hour, a central pressure of 905 millibars, and at that moment, it was the strongest October hurricane ever recorded in the Atlantic. And then it did the most dangerous thing it can do to a ship that's planning around it. It stalled. It began to crawl, and it started to wander. You see, a hurricane, for all its power, doesn't steer itself. It's got all that spin and all that violence, but which way it goes isn't up to the storm. It gets pushed around by the larger winds high above it. The forecasters call it steering current. Picture the whole hurricane as a cork in a river. It can spin all it likes, but where it travels is decided by the current carrying it. Most of the time, that current is strong and fairly readable. A dome of high pressure sits out in the Atlantic, and the winds wrapping around it sweep the storms along a smooth, predictable path, usually out to sea, away from anyone. But every so often, that current just goes slack. The winds that should be carrying the storm along simply aren't there. And a hurricane with nothing to steer it doesn't wind down. It stops going anywhere in particular and starts going everywhere. It stalls, it wobbles, it wanders. You can dodge a hurricane that marches in a straight line. You cannot dodge one that doesn't know where it's going. So Captain March did the responsible thing first. He got the tourists off the boat. He took Fantome into Belize City, and on the 26th of October, he put ashore 97 passengers and 10 of his own non-essential crew. It would have been 11, but sadly, one of his crew, a Honduran man named Jesus Hernandez, had a problem with the paperwork and the Belize immigration wouldn't let him stay. So he stayed on the boat and became one of the infamous 31 left aboard. Now, you might be wondering why they didn't just stay in port and stay in Belize City and ride it out on that dock. But for a big ship in a harbor, a hurricane is a trap. Belize City is shallow, it's low, and it's wide open to the sea. All that hurricane surge would come right up and bash her against the dock. It is not a good place to ride out a hurricane. Out in open water, a sound ship has room to work. Any sailor will tell you sea room is survival. So in the middle of the afternoon, the Fantome let go her lines and went out to try to save herself. And here's where a good man gets bad information. And to be fair, it really wasn't anybody's fault. It was the best forecast available on Earth in 1998, and unfortunately it was wrong. The plan at first was to run north, to get up and around the storm before it could catch her. But as the official forecast firmed up, it said that Mitch was going to curve north towards the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. And if Mitch was going north, then running north was running straight into her, and the Fantome, making 7 knots on her best day, was far too slow to win that race. So March did the textbook thing. He turned around. He ran south, roughly 120 miles, to tuck in to the lee of Roatan. That's the sheltered downwind side of the island. And his plan was to wait there and let the storm pass above him. Except the storm didn't go north. The reason the forecast missed is the hinge of the whole tragedy. Storms like this are supposed to get picked up and flung north. That's what the season and the textbooks say. But a ridge of high pressure built over the western Gulf of Mexico and slammed that door shut. And instead of curving away, Mitch was shoved south and west, down towards the very island chain that March was hiding behind. And the forecasters couldn't see it coming in time, because at the time there was almost no upper air weather data over Mexico and Central America. It was a blind spot in the forecast. Nowadays, we have satellites measuring all that air, and there is no blind spots. But back in 1998, It just didn't exist. With nothing to correct it, the forecast defaulted to what usually happens. And what usually happens didn't happen. The storm turned down right on top of him. And now he was trapped. Now March needed to run, but there was nowhere to run to. Look at where he was. The Yucatan to the west, the coast of Honduras to the south, the Belize Barrier Reef, the second largest reef on the planet, walling off the entire western shore like a big fence. He was boxed into the far dead-end corner of the Caribbean with a storm on top of him, a reef to the left, and no way to get out and get the sea room that he so desperately needed. So why didn't he just find a hurricane hole in there and hide? Cruisers hide from hurricanes all the time. And one of the most famous hurricane holes in the world is right there next to them, Rio Dulce. Rio Dulce is in Guatemala, and it's a river that opens up into a lake, and it's a hurricane hole where sailors have ridden out storms for generations. The problem is, it's behind a sandbar at the river mouth, and that sandbar is maybe 5 or 6 feet of water. Even small cruising sailboats drawing over 6 feet have to wait for high tide and get a dinghy to pull a line from the top of their mast sideways to get heeled over just to scrape across this bar. And the Fantome, drawing 13 feet, more than twice the water available, didn't have a chance to get in there. All the dinghies in the world pulling it sideways still wouldn't get that boat over that bar. In fact, every shallow refuge in that corner of the world, the Rio Dulce, the mangrove holes behind the Belize Reef, was closed to her by the one number that never makes the postcard, her draft. For a ship that big and that deep, there was really only one true escape in that whole corner of the sea. It was the long, hard run offshore, around Guatemala, and down to Panama. And the only way to get there was to go straight east, right into the storm. So all this time, March wasn't alone in his decision-making. He was on the satellite phone to the main office of Windjammer in Miami. They were talking through the plans hour by hour. And I want to make sure you guys understand that this was not the satellite phones that we have today. Those phones are covered by the Iridium system. And that system covers the planet entirely, pole to pole. But in October of 1998, Iridium did not exist yet. Its very first day of commercial service was November 1st, 1998, only 5 days after Fantome went down. So what March had was almost certainly an Inmarsat terminal, the older satellite system, good for voice and fax where a satellite happens to be looking, and that was likely backed up by HF radio with a Pactor modem for email. This is all good gear, but it's not instant. By the early afternoon on the 27th, March made his last play, and in my opinion, it was the right one. He turned and ran east, trying to claw his way out of the reef pocket through the gap between the mainland and the island of Guanaja and into open water where he'd have some room to work. To understand why he went east, you need to understand something that every old sailing ship master knew, and it's the single most important thing I can teach you about hurricanes. A hurricane is not equally dangerous all the way around. Picture the storm from above, spinning counterclockwise and moving across the ocean. One side of it, the starboard side, relative to the direction it's traveling, the wind of the spin and the forward motion of the whole storm compound. Stronger wind, bigger, more vicious seas, and the wind on that side tends to shove a vessel towards the storm's path, towards the center. On the other side, the relative port side, the forward motion subtracts from the spin. The winds are weaker and they tend to blow you away from the storm. This is called the Navigable Semicircle. If, by some crazy chance, you're going to be hit by a hurricane offshore, you want to be in that Navigable Semicircle, that left side. Now here's where the records turn chilling. because we have records almost to the minute. All morning on the 27th, the official advisories held the line. Mitch would drift west, then bend northwest away from the Fantome. Then, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the Hurricane Center issued an update. For the first time in the life of this storm, it contained the words west-southwest. The storm was turning down, onto Roatan, onto the Fantome. At 1:15, only 15 minutes after the report, March and Miami had made a decision. Burke's own words from the last conversation he would ever have with his captain: "We agreed that we only had one choice, to run east, to try to get to the eastern semicircle of that storm, where the wind would shift west-southwest and eventually south, taking us away from land." This decision was probably one of the scariest and hardest decisions this young captain ever had to make, and you have to understand why. If he were to stay in the same spot, west of the center of the storm, the spin of the storm pins him against Honduras and against the reef. Us sailors call that a lee shore. And a lee shore with a Category 5 on top of it is very risky. You are almost certainly going to end up on the rocks. The other option he had was to cut across to the east of its track, where those same winds, as the storm moved behind you, would push you offshore now and give you sea room and give you a fighting chance. And there was only one path to get there: the 24-mile-wide stretch laced with reef between Guanaja and the mainland. He turned east 15 minutes after the first honest piece of information the forecast gave him. Nobody froze, nobody was slow, but you cannot make ground to windward in a hurricane. Mitch was barely moving. This was never a foot race, but every mile March clawed east, 100-mile-an-hour winds and 40-foot walls of water was shoving him back. And the storm kept curving down into the very gap he was steering for. In the end, he just could not make this easting. The last anyone heard from the Fantome was around 4:30 in the afternoon on the 27th of October. She was about 10 miles southeast of Guanaja. March's final report was that he was in winds around 100 miles an hour, seas over 40 feet, and that his ship was rolling 40 degrees. 40 degrees. If you're not a sailor, let me tell you what that means. A ship rolling 40 degrees is being laid onto her side over and over and over. This is right on the edge of something that she cannot recover from. And then the line went dead. The satellite antenna, the voice, and the ship all gone at once. 2.5 hours later, the Hurricane Center issued its next advisory. Mitch had turned again, southeast this time, straight across the gap she'd been running for. Whatever chance the east run ever had was already gone before the sky went dark. One sailing writer looked at the track years later and put it the way every sailor feels, as if she'd been stalked. Around 10 that night, the eye of a Category 5 hurricane passed directly over the patch of sea where she had last been. What happened in those last hours, how a ship that big and that strong actually died, will never be known. No one survived to tell, and the wreck has never been found. But it's not a mystery we have to leave alone. The ship, the sea, the few items that were recovered all tell a story. And we're going to come back to it and give it the reckoning it deserves. But first, let's talk about what was actually found. For days, no one knew. A search launched, the Coast Guard, aircraft, ships, across 140,000 square miles of ocean. On the 2nd of November, a helicopter from a British warship, the HMS Sheffield, found what the sea was willing to return. 2 life rafts, a scatter of life jackets, a piece of wooden staircase, every one of them stenciled with 2 words, SV Fantome. Empty rafts, never launched or launched and lost, and 31 people who were simply not there. A Windjammer spokesman was asked plainly by a reporter if the crew were gone, and his response was, as much as I hate to say it, yes. Officially, no one knows why the Fantome sank. There was never a report, never an investigation, no safety board determined the cause, and the sad truth of this was because she was flagged in Equatorial Guinea, and she was lost in international waters. So there was no authority. There was a search, and then the search ended, and that was it. Her emergency beacon apparently never sent a signal, and her wreck, as I said, has never been located. So we are going to do what the authorities never did. We're going to try to reason it out and figure out what happened to the Fantome. I'd like you to try to play this out with me and follow along and come to your own conclusions, because officially there will never be a correct answer to this. We will never know what happened. So before I lay anything out, knowing what you know now, the steel hull, the towering rig, the 40-foot seas in the corner of ocean she couldn't escape, how do you think she went down? Pick your answer, and we'll see at the end of the video if I've managed to change your mind. Let me walk you through the theories, including the one I believe took her, and let me start with the one many of you are probably already thinking. Theory number 1, hull failure. She was a 71-year-old riveted steel ship. So the natural thought is the simple one. The sea worked her tired old seams loose, and she came apart, popped her rivets, split a seam, filled up, and sank. I don't buy it. Riveted hulls don't usually fail from weather. They fail from impact. You shear a line of rivets and open up a seam when something hits. Another ship, a reef, a rock, a dock, a hard, sudden, concentrated blow in one place. That is collision failure. Steady, spread out loads, even the pounding of a big sea, a riveted hull takes remarkably well. It's the very reason that the Golden Gate Bridge and the Eiffel Tower are still standing after a century out in the weather. Riveted structures are super tough. And I don't think the Fantome hit anything. She was in open water, 10 miles off the reef. So the picture of her quietly cracking apart at the seams, I don't think so. She was strong. Her hull almost certainly held. And that tells us where to look. The water that sank her almost certainly didn't come from below. Probably came from above. Theory number 2, breaking waves. Could she have been simply overwhelmed, pooped by a following sea, a wall of green water coming over the top of the ship faster than her decks could shed it? Possibly. Could she have been dismasted? A falling spar opening up the deck? That's a possibility too. I suspect both may have played some part, but this was a big girl. 300 foot of boat in 40-foot seas. She had big pumps below to handle any water ingress from the waves. It's possible that a catastrophic failure of the rigging pulled down her mast and hauled her deck, but in all the dismastings I've ever seen, I think there would be much more time to send a message out. I think that she went down much quicker. And to understand my theory, you need to understand how a ship this size behaves in 40-foot seas. Theory number 3, she broke her back. It's the question every sailor asks about a ship caught in big seas like that. Did she simply break in two? Here's how that works. A ship's hull is one enormous beam. Drape that beam over a single wave crest amidships, with the bow and stern left hanging over the troughs on either side, and the middle is held up while the ends droop. The hull tries to bend upwards in the middle. Engineers call that hogging. Reverse it, crests lifting the bow and stern with the trough dropping out from the middle, and she bends the other way. This is called sagging. Work a hull back and forth like that hard enough past where the steel can bear it, and she fractures. She breaks her back. It happens, but it happens overwhelmingly to the big ones. The long, fine, heavily loaded tankers and freighters, where the hull is already a strained girder hundreds of feet long. The Fantome was, by comparison, short and stout and much better built. She was a few hundred feet of stoutly built, fully classed hull. No heavy cargo straining her middle. A hull like that is stiff and hard to break. Could a hurricane wave the length of the ship have caught her wrong and cracked her middle? It's definitely a possibility. But I don't believe that's what happened. I think she was rolled, not broken. And to understand why, you need to understand how that same wave can affect a boat depending on its angle of attack. Picture a 40-foot wave, a 4-story mountain of moving water, and put 2 very different boats on it. First, a small boat, a 30 or 40-footer running with the sea that gets picked up from behind and shoved down the face like a surfer. Bow down, accelerating towards the trough, and there, 2 things can kill her. If she slews sideways at the bottom, she broaches. She's thrown beam on and quite likely rolled over. But if she drives that bow straight into the back of the wave ahead while the stern is flung up and over, she'll pitch pull. She'll flip end over end, stern over bow, and do a complete somersault. It's exactly as violent as it sounds. And it has ended a lot of lives in the open ocean. This is why drogues were invented. A drogue will slow you down so you don't fly into that face of the wave in front of you. Now put the Fantome on the very same wave. Nearly 300 feet of ship. She's far too long and far too heavy to be surfed down a wave face or flicked end over end. A single 40-foot wave can't somersault a vessel her size. So pitch pull is off the table. And even breaking her back, as we said, is a long shot. What a sea like this does to a vessel this size is entirely different. It rolls her over. It tries to lay her over on her side, and that, for a top-heavy old schooner carrying a rig she couldn't take down, was the one thing she truly couldn't survive. So here's the sequence I believe played out. In 100-mile-an-hour winds, it would be nearly impossible to keep the nose of that boat directly into the wind. As soon as she got hit by a big breaker, it stops her forward motion, slewing her broadside, and she broaches. The single most dangerous place any boat can be. Because now the next crest doesn't lift her under the keel. It hits her flat on her side, and it tries to roll her over. And every boat has a limit to how far she can be rolled and still come back. An angle past where she will not right herself. Naval architects call it the angle of vanishing stability. The vanishing point. Below that angle, the physics fight to stand her back up. Past it, those very same physics flip around and drive her the rest of the way over. A deep, heavy-keeled sailboat has a very high vanishing angle. On some boats, you can take them past 90 degrees to 120, 130 degrees, and they'll still right themselves. But a big, beamy ship like this, riding high with tall deckhouses and 4 masts towering over her, she has a much lower angle of vanishing stability. Push a ship like that past her vanishing point, and there is no coming back. She just keeps going. Now put the two together in the sea she was actually in. She's trying to claw east across mounting, breaking cross seas, waves stacking in from more than one direction at once, probably refracting off the land to the south. She's carrying a rig she can't reduce, grabbing at wind she can't spill, making it that much harder to hold straight. Her last message already had her rolling 40 degrees, And in a sea like that, it takes exactly one breaking wave face on the wrong side at the wrong instant to push her past that. It slews 282 feet of ship broadside, and that wave rolls her past her vanishing angle. And the moment she goes past it, the whole thing ends in minutes. She's laid over on her beam ends or beyond, and now the companionways and the hatches and the deckhouse doors of a 70-year-old cruise ship are underwater, with none of the watertight subdivision below to wall off the flooding. The sea pours in through the openings, not the seams, the openings. She fills up and she's gone. She didn't need to roll over. She only needed to be knocked down long enough to sink. And if you're thinking this is an old ship problem, like something from the age of sail, think again. Let me hand you a name that you've heard in the news recently, the Bayesian. The Bayesian was a 184-foot modern super yacht, one of the most advanced sailing vessels ever built, carrying one of the tallest aluminum masts in the world. And in August of 2024, she was sitting on anchor off Sicily when a violent burst of wind laid her over past her point of no return, past her angle of vanishing stability. She flooded through her openings and was on the bottom in minutes. 7 people died, including the tech billionaire Michael Lynch and, sadly, his daughter. The investigations into why are still open, and when they close, I'll tell that story properly. But the physics of that are the exact same physics we're talking about here. Wind on a towering rig, a hull rolling past her vanishing angle, and a sea finding the openings. 97 years between these two boats. Same sea, same ocean, same physics. And remember those 2 life rafts found floating off Guanaja? That is exactly what a ship going over in minutes leaves behind. There was no time. And that's why I think this is what took her. Remember, this is a reconstruction, not a recovered logbook. Nobody can prove it, but it isn't just my hunch. The sailors and naval architects who have studied this loss come down in roughly the same place. A ship overwhelmed and rolled in survival conditions, flooding through her openings and not her hull. And one tall shipmaster, Captain Andy Chase, who teaches ship handling at the Maine Maritime Academy, looked at the whole hopeless setup and told the New York Times exactly what he'd have done in that harbor. I could not have gotten underway in any direction except the airport, and the hell out of there. So the verdict I'll give you, the one that the court never did, is this. The hull didn't fail her. It was everything above the waterline that killed her. The rig she couldn't drop, the openings she couldn't close, and that corner of the ocean that didn't give her enough room to escape. That's my guess, but like I said, your guess is as good as mine. And this is where I have to break the shape of these stories, because this is the part where I usually talk about what has changed and what's improved and what this tragedy taught the world. But in this instance, I am sorry to report that I can't. Because the honest answer is almost nothing has changed. The families of the crew sued, and one of their lawyers put the whole thing into a single sentence you won't forget. Basically, they knew the hurricane was brewing, they got all the American passengers off, and then sailed right into a Category 5 hurricane and were never seen again. But the case never really got its day, because in 2002, a U.S. court sent it away, shipped it off to Panama on a technicality, and never ruled on whether anyone had been negligent at all. The families, most of them from that town in Guyana, settled for figures capped by an old maritime law that treats a sailor's life as a column of lost wages. Some got a couple $100,000. The company sailed on for another decade before it finally collapsed under its own weight. Nobody was ever held to account for putting a deep old ship full of low-paid crew into that corner of the sea in that week of the year. The passengers went home. The crew did not. And the law, in the end, just shrugged. So here's what I need to tell you, especially if you're one of those type of people that dreams of doing this. selling the house, quitting the job, buying the boat, cutting the lines, and taking off into the sunset. Charters still run through the hurricane season. That hasn't stopped. I have friends that sail through the Caribbean all summer long, a lot of them running from hurricanes. What has changed is the game has gotten harder, and the people that watch this risk for a living have been exiting this space. If it's not worth it for them, it probably shouldn't be worth it for you. For decades, there's been a thing sailors just call the box. It's a rectangle on a chart running roughly from 12 degrees 40 north up to the mid-20s that most marine insurers will simply not cover you inside this box during hurricane season. You need to get your boat south of that line by June and you'll be insured. Stay inside of it and you're on your own. And for years and years, the promised land just below that line was Grenada, 12 degrees north, below the box, below the hurricanes. Everybody went there. Every summer, whole fleets of cruising boats parked in Grenada precisely because the insurance companies blessed it as the safe place. And then, in July of 2024, the sea called the bluff. A storm named Beryl came through in the first week of the season and flattened Carriacou. That hurricane turned the safe anchorage at Tyrrell Bay into a boat graveyard in one afternoon. Then she kept going and became the earliest Category 5 ever recorded in the Atlantic. Not the strongest, the earliest. In the first week of the season, that line failed, and the calendar failed with it. And that's when the industry's faith finally broke. Since Beryl, the box has been getting bigger, the safe zone shoving further south, named storm coverage is effectively gone. And many underwriters are now walking away from the boat scene. They don't want anything to do with it because of that hurricane risk. And it's not them being cowards. They're reading the same water I read. And to be completely blunt with you, weather is getting worse on the planet, not better. The storms are winding up faster than they used to. They're coming earlier and later than they used to. They're stronger than they used to be. And that exact corner of the Caribbean is much busier now than it was even one generation ago. So let me say the non-romantic thing out loud because it needs to be said. We are not sailing into a safer era. We are sailing into a more dangerous one. The window to get away with it in the hurricane season is closing, not opening. And the lesson that the crew the Fantome paid for, that a strong boat is not a safe one, and that the calendar and the chart will kill you if you disrespect them, is more true today than it was in 1998. Learn that deep down in your bones. And maybe those 31 sailors didn't teach us that for nothing. So let me take you for a moment to New Amsterdam in Guyana, a working town on a brown river, the kind of place a young man leaves to go and make a living at sea and sends the money home. 11 of its sons went out on the Fantome. 11 of them didn't come back. Try to picture what a single night like that does to a place that small. And how many houses on how many streets got the same impossible news in the same week. And Guyan March, 32, the golden boy who, by every account, did the careful, professional, textbook thing at nearly every turn, and who, somewhere in that last afternoon of 40-degree rolls, on a phone to an office 2,000 miles away, must have understood where that trap had closed. At the start of this video, I told you what scares me out here. Not the rocks, not the sharks, not the pirates, it's the hurricanes. The Fantome is that fear in one boat. The strongest made ship, the most talented young captain, and none of it was enough. So take the practical lesson if you take nothing else from this video. A strong boat is not a safe boat in hurricane season. Respect the season, respect the water, and try to look at the macro picture of where you're sailing. I'm a rational man, and a hurricane is just physics. Warm water, wind, low pressure, and a name is just a name. But any sailor that's been on the water for long enough will be somewhat superstitious. And here's what I can't quite nail down. She was called Fantome, the French word for ghost. A ship named for a phantom that disappeared without a trace, taken by the 13th storm of the year. And the one thing that could have saved all of them was 5 days from being switched on for the first time in history. Call it a coincidence. On dry land, in daylight, I probably would too. But every sailor I know has had a night like this in them, where the sea seemed to know something you didn't. And there's more to the ocean than floats on the surface. I'm James. Fair winds, and I'll see you in the next one.